Hi everyone. I wanted to give a quick overview of Reconstruction for your review. So here it goes. I always like to start my discussion on Reconstruction with a book written by the well-known historian Eric Foner. Now, I don't really expect you to read this book, but I would encourage you to note the title of this book, America's Unfinished Revolution. Those three words have such meaning and analysis to them. Reconstruction was an attempt at social, political, and economic revolution, but it fell short in so many ways that it is best categorized as unfinished. Additionally, the historiography of Reconstruction, biased by the racism of the time, most notably the movie Birth of a Nation, have continued to give a somewhat skewed view of what the so-called radical Republicans were trying to attempt during Reconstruction. It all makes for one of the most important periods of American history. The South was completely devastated after the war, and in many ways viewed the war, its leaders, and objectives as noble failures. This can be seen even today at places like Stone Mountain, Georgia, as well as the fact that Lee Jackson Day is still celebrated in Virginia, ironically on the Friday before Martin Luther King Day. Stone Mountain, Georgia, for those of you who don't know, is sometimes referred to as the Mount Rushmore of the South, and gets thousands and thousands of visitors today. And here Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, and Stonewall Jackson are immortalized on this mountain, carved into this mountain. This monument, found at Gettysburg, illustrates how many in the South viewed the Civil War and gives great insight into their view on Reconstruction. This is what the inscription says: that men of honor might forever know the responsibilities of freedom, dedicated South Carolinians stood and were counted for their heritage and convictions, abiding faith in the sacredness of states' rights, provided their creed here, many earned eternal glory. So this attitude, this idea of the lost cause, as it's sometimes referred to, is going to have a huge impact not only on Reconstruction, but in some ways even more importantly, on the historiography of Reconstruction. In other words, how Reconstruction is taught to future generations. Now, it would seem a foregone conclusion that slavery would be abolished at the end of the war. But what would freedom be like for the new slave, for the freed slaves? Would they have social freedom, political freedom, economic freedom? Economic freedom? Would they have the right to serve as jurors? All these questions remained unanswered, and many who were even opposed to slavery did not view African Americans as equal to white society. And there's still a tremendous amount of racism in America during this time period. Now, Lincoln wanted to end the Civil War and bring the country back together. We will never know entirely his plans for the South and for Reconstruction. In Lincoln's second inauguration, he states that it is with malice towards none and charity for all, and his plans for Reconstruction allows the South to be easily readmitted into the Union. Called Lincoln's 10% plan, he stated that a state could be readmitted after 10% of the population agreed to a loyalty oath. Congress believed that the president had overstepped his authority and refused to admit the southern states who took Lincoln up on his proposal. The stage was set for a fight between the president and Congress. Lincoln had exercised so much authority during the war that it would seem that Congress was trying to exert its influence over Reconstruction. Congress passed the Wade-Davis bill. This bill demanded not 10%, but 50% loyalty, as well as a repudiation of debts. In other words, the federal government of the United States wasn't going to pay the state debt that the South incurred fighting them in the Civil War. And it guaranteed that slavery would be abolished. Now, this was a very unique time in American politics because the Senate and the House were overwhelmingly Republicans. It takes 2/3 of Congress to override a presidential veto, a percentage that normal party politics almost assures will never happen. In this case, however, the Republicans could have easily overridden Lincoln's veto. Once again, Lincoln demonstrates his savvy awareness of the political realities of being president by using something called the pocket veto. Lincoln does not sign the bill into law, neither does he veto it. He refuses to do either. He metaphorically puts it into his pocket. He uses a technicality, being that it was near the end of the congressional session. Lincoln was able to just stall Congress. Now, This is where Lincoln's story ends. It's fascinating to wonder if Lincoln would have been able to navigate the complexities of Reconstruction as masterfully as he had the Civil War. Um, I like to think that Lincoln would have been able to handle Reconstruction. Lincoln was a brilliant, adroit, savvy leader, but we'll never know. What we do know for sure is that there is little doubt that his successor was ill-equipped for the job. He was simply the wrong man at the wrong place at the wrong time. Andrew Johnson was a hot-tempered Democrat from Tennessee. Lincoln chose his Democrat from the South as his vice president in part as a symbol of forgiveness to the South. Lincoln, however, could not have foreseen his death, and in his place, he left the most unlikely of person, a Southern Democrat who was opposed to Republican Reconstruction with little political or social skills to resolve the conflict with Congress. Andrew Johnson's plan for Reconstruction, interestingly enough, was very similar to Lincoln's. In some ways, it was even more strict in its treatment of former Confederate leaders. What it lacked, however, was Lincoln's political adroitness and his popularity. Congress will take over Reconstruction and fight Johnson throughout the process. A good example of this is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau, which was run by former Northern General O.O. Howard. Today, Howard University is named after him. You may be familiar with that. Was an attempt to help former slaves by providing food, clothing, and access to education. It was detested by the South, twice vetoed by Johnson. Because the Republicans had an overwhelming majority in Congress, they could easily override his vetoes. Now, this is the formula. You can see here former slaves lining up to get food and clothing, and schools were opened up. Later, we're going to talk about carpetbaggers and scallywags, which often get a raw deal in history. This is your average carpetbagger, a woman who comes to the South to teach hundreds and hundreds of slaves under the threat of the KKK. But we'll talk about that more later. This is going to be the formula that happens time and time again. Congress passes legislation, Johnson vetoes it, and Congress overrides his veto. Like I said, time and time again this will occur. Eventually, Congress passes a law known as the Tenure of Office Act, which restricted Johnson's ability to fire members of Lincoln's, which was now his cabinet. Johnson believed that this was an unconstitutional law, so he fired Edwin Stanton. By the way, decades later, the Supreme Court will rule that this is an unconstitutional law. But Johnson had fallen for a trick. When he fires Stanton, he technically broke the law. Congress would use this action as an excuse and an opportunity to impeach Johnson. Although Johnson was able to remain in office, the Senate was only one vote shy of removing him. Johnson was virtually powerless for the rest of his presidency, and Congress took complete control over Reconstruction. Now, what I'd like to look at, we just got done talking about presidential Reconstruction, Johnson and Lincoln. What I'd like to look at is the age-old social, political, and economic. That's what social studies teachers always talk about, right? So I want to look at the social, political, and economic impact of Reconstruction and what was attempted to be done by radical Republicans in Congress, and how in many ways it was forestalled or even completely stopped by Southern opposition. So let's look at social reforms. The 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. All people must be treated equally and given due process under the law. Sounds good, right? What could go wrong with that? How is that met with the South? That was met by the KKK. That was met through Jim Crow laws, which enforced segregation. These are the images that we're very accustomed to, right? And we're talking about after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877 Reconstruction. These images are from the 1950s. This policy of Jim Crow continues for the next 100 years. Economic reforms. Former slaves who had been forced to work on plantations had little or no economic opportunity. What are they going to do now that slavery is ended? There was a very popular idea called 40 acres and a mule. Every slave family should get 40 acres and a mule so that they can have economic opportunity. It never passes. What is in its place? Sharecropping, which is essentially very similar to slavery. For those of you who saw the book, saw the movie or read the book, The Help, you see the economic impact of slavery and Reconstruction literally 100 years later. And just I always find this interesting. You know, Kanye West. I don't know. This is funny me saying this, but if you've ever heard this song, where he references, "We trying to buy back our 40 acres, and for that paper, look how low we stoop." I believe that's the exact way he raps too. Uh, it illustrates. I wonder how many people understand this reference. Way to go, Kanye. And of course, you know, sharecropping. And this map I find so fascinating because this is obviously the same parcel of land. This is 1860 during slavery, and you can see that the slave quarters are all bunched together. You can see that essentially the slaves are still there, but now they're involved in a sharecropping situation. Very little changed for African Americans in terms of economic impact. What about political reforms? The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote, but literacy tests, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, all denied African Americans the right to vote. The KKK enforced it, and ironically enough, because the Three-Fifths Clause was no longer in effect, the South actually gained representation in Congress and in terms of the Electoral College. We call this the Solid South, the idea that they voted as a block of Democrats. And that political power that they gained from losing the Civil War. This is the great irony, right? Is what's going to help them retain and enforce policies of segregation and discrimination against African Americans for close to 100 years. It's quite ironic and, in my opinion, you know, fascinating. So who were these radical Republicans, and why are they called radical Republicans anyway? Well, we have the first African American senators and congressmen. There's this brief window where Reconstruction is being enforced by these radical Republicans, and you see a degree of political opportunity for African Americans and political freedom for African Americans. You're not going to see African American congressmen again for almost 100 years. Radical Republicans, you might remember poor Charles Sumner was beaten severely by Preston Brooks. He comes back to the scene and he's the leader of the Senate, and then sometimes referred to as the Great Commoner, Thaddeus Stevens, who is the leader of the Radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. The Radical Republicans is oftentimes used as a pejorative, and you might sometimes see that they wanted to punish the South. I believe that that's not entirely fair. When you look at what they wanted to do, they wanted to provide full equality for African Americans. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, they wanted those laws to be enforced by federal troops. We're going to talk in class quite a bit, not so much on this screencast, how the historiography of radical Republicans has been skewed quite a bit to make it more of a negative term. Similarly, as I referenced earlier, scallywags and carpetbaggers. Scallywags were Southerners who participated in Northern Reconstruction, and carpetbaggers, here's U.S. Grant coming down to the South on a carpetbag, for those of you who don't know what a carpetbag is. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who traveled to the South to engage in Reconstruction. Now, as we're going to learn later, this was a period that was known for corruption, a period that we're going to talk about known as the Gilded Age, where there was a tremendous amount of corruption. So there was corruption associated with some of these people, but the vast majority of them were people who, like that school teacher who opened up the Freedman School, were people who were earnestly trying to aid former slaves during Reconstruction. So that is, as promised, a very brief review of Reconstruction, and certainly I'm going to be lecturing on it in class, and you have your textbook as well, but I hope this provides a little support with the upcoming midterm.